Okay, so now we're going to talk about power and intercultural communication. Let's see. Yeah, well, why should we talk about this? Well, we know that the world is increasingly characterized by contacts between people who have different cultural backgrounds. That's you all in this room are example of that. And we're stuck with an increase of intercultural contacts, I would say, for the next 1 to 200 years. Why only 1 to 200 years? Well, this is a pure speculation on my part. It could be that we're all going to speak English, we're all going to speak Chinese at that time, you know. Depends on who gets the upper hand. But you're all going to be dead before that happens. So, in the meantime, we better get ready for intercultural communication. And in intercultural communication, power differences are very often important in different ways. And we're going to discuss today what type of power differences could be relevant. If we can understand the nature of these power differences, this will perhaps enable us to manage them a bit and handle them when we are communicating interculturally. Okay, so as usual, I'll give you a task to start with. Try to give a definition of interpersonal power. Talk to your neighbors.
Somebody has somebody makes somebody
So, let's hear definition from someone. This morning when we did a definition of ethics, we managed to dig up many of the aspects that we had to discuss later on. Let's see if we can do the same thing now. Somebody must have... you two look like you have something
We were just saying he's going to ask us.
Yes. Because I asked you this morning and you came
Well,
up.
I mean, we're just talking about roles, like within a workplace, it would be between a boss and employer and employee. It could also be a parent and a child.
Yeah. What you're doing now is you're giving examples of power relations. That's always a good
so
step.
it's where
Well, let me just say this. That's a good first step
Yeah.
when you want to give a definition. Start by having some nice examples that you think of. Then try to say something more general.
Okay. So I would say it's where one part has well, the perception of having an upper hand in the relationship to the other person.
If you have the perception that you have the upper hand, you could be tragically mistaken. And you don't see, then in the end you turn out to have no power. So that's maybe not such a good definition of having power. Yeah, you want to say something?
Yeah, we discussed different privileges and inequality.
Yeah.
Like the definition of power could be, for instance, like if you have two people and there is an inequality between them, then usually one has more power for some or other reasons, and it can often have to do with privileges. For instance,
but then usually you have more power. What's that mean to have more power?
to be more privileged in
To
certain.
be more privileged. Could you be privileged without having power?
Well, we discussed, like, for instance, in some cases, like with the different societal norms, for instance, male and female, men often have more power.
But what does it mean to have more power?
What does it mean? Well,
Yeah, that's what we're supposed to get at.
okay, well, it means to be more accepted in a way, have more.
So to be accepted without having power? Yeah.
Maybe if you know something that others don't know.
Sorry. No.
If you know something that others don't know. Like
You know something without having power. How about all the powerless academics who think they know?
To be dominant.
What does it mean to be dominant?
To be dominant is to be in control.
What does it mean to be in control?
To have an advantage in interpersonal communication. Dominance in interpersonal communication.
Yeah. Let's hear more. Yeah.
We were talking about being able to influence the other discipline and to make somebody think or feel the way you want them to feel. So the ability to change the way the other
No,
person
I'm getting closer to what I want. So he's saying influencing other people, getting them to think and feel the way you want them to act and feel, etc. Yeah?
who controls?
Louder.
Who controls the situation?
Who could? Yeah, but then we need to know what it means to control. That's what he just said, I think. So that's good. Yeah.
Yeah, to have the power is to have the resources in that special context.
Could you have power without having resources?
Well, but resources can be different things. It doesn't have to be.
Resources?
Yeah, maybe it doesn't have to be material or.
No, but could you have power without having resources? If you say yes, then it's not part of the definition. Then it's something which is helpful but not part of the definition. If you say no, then I'm going to ask you to show me how the resources are always part of it. Yeah,
Well, I was going to say about the same thing,
about the same thing.
but no, I don't really believe you can have power without it.
Okay, so you want to go that way. Okay, so let's say that, well, I don't know, you have two boys where one seems to command the other one. What resources does that boy have?
Perhaps
Yeah, but that's the same as control. Not a
there's a
reason.
reason that the is more dominant than the other.
You're just saying that,
Perhaps there's a parent who favors the boy more than the other.
let's focus on it. The only thing you said, which I could interpret as a resource, is age. Okay? So why is age a resource in commanding the other boy?
Because generally, people who are older generally of their communities reinforced by
Only a resource in a certain cultural context where age is actually seen as something that gives you the right to control another person.
Yeah.
So that's right. But I'm not sure I want to make resource a part of that. But if you do, you have to walk that way. Right? Yeah. Okay, good. I think we've got a lot of the material on the table that we need to discuss, as we did this morning with ethics. We'll now discuss many of the things you've said a little more. Let's see, why is it so slow? Is it strange? It's not working. Oh, there we go. Okay, so my definition comes pretty close to what you said, I think. So it's A has interpersonal power over B if and only if with two F's means if and only if A can control B's behavioral thoughts. That's more or less what you said, right? Sleeping? Wait, I'm sorry. You recognize this?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, if we compare this definition to what the guy who's fairly famous in social science, Giddens, he wrote, by power is meant the ability of individuals or groups to make their own concerns or interests count even where others resist. Power sometimes involves the direct use of force, but is almost always also accompanied by the development of ideas, ideology, which justify the actions of the powerful. Basically, the definition I gave and this definition they're the same. But you could say that he's giving a kind of special case of my definition. I mean, even if the ability of individuals or groups to make their own concerns or interests, yeah, but that has to result in ability to control the other person's thoughts or actions. So actually he's just sort of stating a number of interesting facts which you can put in a more, what shall I call it, austere definition that I get. I am having problem with this. It's not responding to me.
Talk nice to it.
Please help me.
Try it now.
Why not?
Maybe we need to restart the program.
Maybe I need to restart the program. Can't even exit it. Maybe I have to restart the whole computer.
Could I ask you something? Giddens belongs to critical theory.
Yeah, well, sort of. He's sort of his own stance. He's not the German school. You mean the Frankfurt school? Adorno, Horkheimer, perhaps Habermas. Yeah, no, he's a little outside of
Because
us.
I know this before was from the school of Frankfurt, but now nowadays we have different options, perspective about critical theories. But I think Giddens belongs to.
In a wide sense, I agree. He has it kind of, but it's not the Marxist perspective necessarily. Which often when you talk about critical theory, you have sort of Marxist perspective in mind. Okay. Now, something else we can note about power is that people can have complex relations. So if you have a husband and a wife, the husband will dominate the wife in some ways and the wife can dominate the husband in other ways. So that means that once you dominate another person, once you control the other person's actions and behavior, you might say that there's an asymmetrical relation between the two people. But sometimes you can have a kind of mixed symmetry. So you control the other person in some ways and the other person controls you in some ways. So that's mixed symmetry. But sometimes you control the other person in all ways. Maybe perhaps we talked about slave societies before we had the lunch break. Okay, in those societies maybe there was more of a total asymmetrical situation, but I think even in those situations it was the slaves controlled the masters also in some ways. This is not good. How can I get out of this? Oh my God, okay. Okay, if we look at how control can be exercised, it can be exercised. Oh, now I got it. Thank you. I wonder if I can. Somebody suggested I restart the whole thing.
It always helps.
Yeah, okay.
This is conference for. No, because I already. I'm not part of it. Well, you can still do it. Okay, let's hope this works better. I restarted the whole thing. Now we can discuss how you can exercise control over another person. So you can exercise control directly by direct order. For example, I could tell him stand up. Are you going to stand up? No. You did. I was successful. Very good. Superior. Okay.
it can also be done in a more implicit way by restricting other people's freedom by rules and regulations. They might not even know that you are the person who are making those rules, but they follow the rules. You put them there to enlarge your own power. Sometimes people are just born into a society where there are such rules. They think things have to be that way, and they learn that they should act that way, and then they start to think that, oh, I have to be like this, so they think they are voluntarily restricting their own behavior, and sometimes it might even be voluntarily. Okay. So here, these are positive direction, implicit restriction by rules and regulations, or by the other person who is being dominated, voluntarily restricting their own behavior in the way which is in the interest of the power wielder. So if you control B, another way to talk about that is to say that you dominate B. And you could also talk about B is your subordinate, and the person who has power is the superordinate. Okay, so let's now discuss the issue of what is intercultural communication and what is power in intercultural communication. First, we'll just look at the issue of when we should think of something as intercultural communication. Is it enough that we have two people with different cultural backgrounds? Or do they have to... well, that's not the issue here, right? I'm going to discuss that in a while. Now, this issue is a different one. This is the issue of if all intercultural power issues are issues of communication. Well, many are, but are all of them? So when you have discrimination of various types, exploitation, is that always a question of communication? So what do you think?
Could be ethics.
Yeah, of course ethics are involved, but it still could be communication. That's what we talked about before the lunch break. Ethics and communication. But is always exploitation and discrimination a question? So ethics is involved, but is it always communication? Yeah?
Well, I guess it could be if it's always involving withholding information or providing the wrong information to somebody to control them or discriminate them or exploit them in some way.
Yeah. Well, let's say you're, putting a bigger tax on some people in society than on others. That has been the case in many countries historically. For example, Jews were taxed more heavily than Christians in some Christian countries, etc. Is that communication?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Why?
Because it's saying something. The action is saying something.
Yeah, and you might say, okay, even if it's on the surface, you don't see the communication in it. But if you look more deeply, of course, the information has to be given to the Jews that they have to pay deeper. So communication in some way is probably always involved. Even though it looks on the surface that communication is not directly involved. Communication is not directly involved, but it could be more indirectly as a means for the exploitation. Okay, so let's now go on. Now we come to the question I wanted to discuss. When do we have intercultural communication? Is it enough that we have two people with different cultural backgrounds? Or do we have to also require that one or more of the participants are aware of this intercultural difference? So we have two people, in the first case we have two people who come from different cultures. They both speak excellent English. They don't notice that they come from different cultures. But they come from different cultures. So from that criterion you would then say that this is intercultural communication. In the second case, they are aware that they come from different cultures. They still speak English. In the third case, then, now we should have another case here. That is that this difference also influences them. So they start to do different things because they come from different cases. And in a fourth case, maybe, they now start to classify their own interaction as intercultural communication. So I don't know how many of these criteria you think are necessary. How many people think that if you just have two people from two different cultures and they communicate, it's intercultural communication? Number one. If they are aware that they come from different cultures, is it intercultural communication? How many people? Okay. How many people think that that's not enough? The difference has to influence them in what they do. Okay. And how many people think that that's not enough? They also themselves have to call what they're doing intercultural communication. Nobody. So we see most of you are thinking that either it's enough that they are aware of the fact that they have different cultural backgrounds, or the difference should somehow influence their communication. Yeah, I think that's a reasonable stand. But the first and the last are not so reasonable. Namely, where you say that even if they're not aware, if they're just the fact that they come from different cultural backgrounds, that's not really enough. And it's a little too much to require that they're calling it intercultural communication.
But for example, if I observe them and I know, but they don't know that they are intercultural,
that's like the first
who
case.
Says, like, for whom it is intercultural communication?
Yeah, well, for you then, as an observer,
Yes.
you might decide that you're going to call it that, even if the two people are not aware of it in any way.
Yes.
Okay. What this brings out is what I have here, the perspective of the participants versus the perspective of the observer or the analyst. Okay, and some people who analyze intercultural communication and power and so on, they think that only one of these perspectives is valid. So they usually come out saying that you have to have the perspective of the participants. Other people say no, it's okay to take the outsider perspective. The people themselves might not be aware of everything that's relevant. Okay? These two perspectives are very often used. So sometimes you call the first perspective the member orientation. And sometimes even more confusingly and difficult to understand, you call the same perspective the emic perspective. How many of you have heard this term? Emic and ethic? Never heard? It's quite common in social science to call the inside perspective, so to speak, the participant's perspective, called the emic perspective, and the outsider's perspective is called the ethic perspective. Not ethic, but ethic. Actually, it's an analogy from linguistics, which is a bit doubtful, but it comes from the distinction between phoneme and phonetic, phonemic and phonetic. Where phonemic is classifying the sounds according to a certain language system, while phonetic is more general kind of biological, physical classification of speech sound. So that corresponds to the outside perspective. Okay, so those who argue in favor of the outsider's perspective also being a good perspective are, for example, to be found among Marxists. So if you know about the concept, Marx had a concept of false consciousness. That meant that a worker could be very happy working for a capitalist and, enjoying the whole thing, but the capitalist was still exploiting the worker even if the worker was not aware of it himself. And Marx called this false consciousness. And it's a clear example of how you say that the outsider's perspective might be valid even though the insiders don't understand. Okay? I think you can find other examples too. Yeah, you want to say something?
Yeah, so that false consciousness, that refers to the worker's consciousness, right?
Yes, according to the Marxist observer, who understands that they don't really understand. They don't really understand what's happening. They don't understand that they're being exploited. They're happy, they shouldn't be happy. That's the idea. Okay. So exactly the same kind of distinctions can be made with regard to power. If you have two people who are communicating, where one has a lot of power over the other one, and they don't notice this, but an outsider could notice that one has power over the others, but they're perfectly happy. They continue like this. One is dominating the other one, and they don't notice it themselves. Do we have power then? Do they have to notice it themselves? Does the power difference have to make a noticeable difference for them? Or, and do they themselves have to call it power and domination? So it's the same questions as we had for intercultural communication. But I think the same idea that I just explained to you in relation to intercultural communication could be held here also. Both perspectives, the insider's perspective and the outsider's perspective, are valid. Sometimes we want to understand what the participants themselves feel about this relationship, and sometimes we say, okay, an outside observer could perhaps see that one of them is exploiting the other one, even if they don't notice it themselves. But this question of what perspective you should have on social relations, if you should have a participant's perspective or an outsider's perspective, has been debated a lot in social science, and people take sides in this debate, and it's still continuing. I mean, it's applicable to many of the issues in social science, in fact. Okay, I think you understand this now. So my position, as I said, is that both perspectives are possible, and depending on circumstances, one or the other is relevant. Okay, I don't know if you remember this from the course on interpersonal communication. Indicate, display, and signal. Remember this?
Yeah.
Okay. Indicate is when people around you can draw conclusions about you from your behavior, but you're not aware of it yourself. Then you're indicating something. So probably I'm not coming into this room to communicate to you that I am male, a man, but my whole way of talking, being, etc. is indicating this information. I could come into this room to show you that I am, I don't know, interested in communication. And then I would be displaying, I'm showing my interest in issues of communication. I could also come into this room in order to show you that I'm showing you, then I'm signaling. So that's the most aware, most intentional type of communication. That's what you normally do in communication. Now, apply this to power. It's obvious that power can be indicated. People are not aware themselves that they are in a subordinate or superordinate position, so it can be indicated. It can also be displayed. I'm showing you that I have power, or I'm showing you that I am subordinate. You bow to your boss, you show it in all sorts of ways that he's the boss, or she. Nowadays in Sweden there are many she bosses, not just he bosses. Okay? Or you could signal what's going on. Okay, so all of these levels indicate, display, signal, or relevant for how power can be manifested between people. Okay, now let's look at some sources of power in intercultural communication. So the first source we'll look at is macro-social political status differences between different national cultures and languages. Okay. Second thing we'll look at is how power is ascribed internally in different cultures. And then we will look at two special cases of that. Differences in long-term relations, like being a mother or father, or there are many long-term relations. We'll also look at more short-term relations, such as those which might happen in a particular social activity. So right now I am the lecturer, so I may in some sense have more power than you. But that's after, what is it going to be? An hour or so more, then you leave me and you do what the hell you like, so to speak. Okay, so I'm not your father or your mother. So we're going to look at these special cases. So we'll start by looking at macro social differences between national cultures and languages. Languages and cultures primarily dominate as a consequence of dominance established commercially and militarily, money and guns. Why was Latin such an important language in the Western world? Because of the Roman Empire. They didn't have guns, but they had swords. Why was Greek at one point a very dominant language around the whole Mediterranean region? Well, because, again, Alexander the Great and the Greek had weapons that militarily gave them dominant position. Why was French such an important language in the beginning of the 19th century? Remember Napoleon and his conquests. Why is English so important today?
Because we rock.
Did you say rock or rock?
Well, both.
Yeah, but it's not, you're Canadian or American, right?
Canadian.
Yeah, Canadian. Well, you're actually one of the offsprings of British imperialism.
We're reminded of it every day by our currency.
Right. Okay, so but in any case, why is Chinese dominant around East Asia? And why do they hope to be more dominant? Maybe not militarily right now, but maybe money. Financially. So money and guns go together and it gives dominance. Secondarily, cultures and languages may dominate by having been associated earlier historically with commercial and military power. So that's very clearly the case for Latin. So the Roman Empire collapsed, let's say around 400 AD. But Latin continued to be the scientific language to the 1800s. So that's like 1,400 years. So just by being associated with such a power, it could continue. You might imagine that, let's say, Anglo-American military and commercial power collapsed. How long would English continue to still be the world language? Might continue for a long time, even if there was no real commercial or military power behind it. So this might be a problem for the Chinese if they hope to take over. Who knows? Yeah. So today the most powerful nations are clearly, I think, English, and you might discuss if it's Chinese in number 2 place. I mean, I think some people from the Spanish-speaking world might say it's Spanish, because they have also quite a lot of power. But I think those are the 3 main contenders: Spanish, English, and Chinese. Then a little lower down on the list you get Arabic, maybe you get Indonesian. You have to be in the class of a couple of 100 million speakers to be on this list. Okay, Arabic. Yeah. When you go into most countries, there are dominant groups and less dominant groups. So nations are often dominated by one dominant group whose language and culture dominate within that nation. So that Sweden is a typical example of that. In Sweden, Swedish and the Swedes dominate, but we have other ethnic groups here who never were able to really dominate. Maybe the most important such group are the Samis or the Lapps, who've been here for a long time. But you have to go back several thousand years to the time when they dominated Sweden. Okay, members of dominant groups tend to have dominance in interaction between groups, often because they speak their own language and use their own culture and are thus judges of appropriateness. So if you go to a meeting between people from many different countries, and let's say it's held in English, for whom is it easy to dominate that meeting? Clearly, people who have English as their first language. Of course. So our friend from Canada here.
There's another one here, so don't just pick.
There's another one. Who's the other person? Are you? Okay.
The smart one.
Yeah, that's right. Both of you benefit from this. That's not much we can do about it. Sometimes, sometimes you're not aware of it and sometimes you are. But I mean, that's the way it is. Everybody else is using English as a kind of foreign language where they have to struggle more. So, and of course that gives them less of an ability to dominate. That's very clear in all international scientific meetings, in international scientific publications, in the mass media, everywhere, commercially everywhere. Having the language at your fingertips, using it, freely, easily, of course it gives you power. And so you see how that power is associated with the national, military and commercial dominance. Okay, to some extent, this ranking of nations is also reflected when you come to particular countries and you look at immigrants who come to that country. For example, in Sweden, I would say that immigrants from English-speaking countries have an easier time than immigrants from, let's say, Arabic-speaking countries. That's just the way it is. Or immigrants from, let's say, Norway, Denmark, have an easier time also. So they are more. That's it. So this international kind of dominance hierarchy is also reflected in how you treat immigrants and the way immigrants are treated in different countries. So I say again, linguistic dominance can sometimes be non-intentional and non-aware, and sometimes it needs an analyst to point it out. But now again, you can see the contrast between the outside observer, who shows you that actually this is the way it is, and then you have the inside observer. So maybe we could have asked you, John, do you think you're dominant because of your language? And before we had this discussion, you might have said no.
I don't think I'm dominant in either case.
No, see, you still say no. Even after I pointed it out to you. Good. Okay. Am I having this? Nope. Okay, I think it's good time to take a break, actually. We'll take a 10-minute break. Do you remember we were talking about different sources of power in intercultural communication? And the first source we discussed was the position of national countries in terms of military and economic strength. And that also gives you a certain dominance in terms of language and culture. Okay, now another thing I said that I would talk about is long-term relations and short-term relations. So we'll start by things which are a little more long-term. If we look around cultures, we'll see that there are such things as age differences, gender differences, differences in family, clan, caste, differences in ethnic group, differences in wealth, differences in organizational political position. So expectations concerning such differences might differ between participants in communication and cause surprise, disruption, misunderstanding, discomfort, and dislike. Okay, so if we look at these differences a bit more in detail, in many cultures, age differences are important, and you are supposed to almost automatically give respect to older people. In some languages, you have special forms in the language, so you have to address, for example, your older brother or your older sister by special terms. Who speaks a language like that? Okay, which is your language again?
Gujarati.
Gujarati.
Yeah.
And you have special terms for older brother and so on. And you have to speak younger.
Well, not older brother, but brother and sister.
So it's just gender, not age.
Yeah, when it comes to brother and sister, but when it comes to my dad's brother, we have different.
Okay, but so
Younger
even
or
in
older.
Swedish we have that. We call him uncle.
No, but I mean different for older or younger.
Oh, so your dad's younger and older brother have to be addressed differently.
Yeah.
Ah, that's more complicated. Chinese, you also have different terms for older brother and so on, right? Younger brother. Yeah.
More complicated.
Even more complicated. Yeah. Yeah, so many languages have this thing about respect for older people. And in the West, we might say that we used to have more of it, but it sort of gradually disappeared more and more. So there was a lot more of it, let's say, 50 years ago than there is today. Gender differences. In many cultures, men have more power than women, perhaps in all cultures, but again, there's a big variation. In some cultures, they have a lot more power, and in some cultures, they just have a little more power. So that's a big source also, and also in many languages of the world, you have to think of the gender or sex of the other person when you address them. I think maybe in all languages I'm aware of you have to do that. So in English, for example, you don't call your, let's say, brother, your father's brother and sister are not given the same title. One is called uncle and the other one is called auntie, right? Auntie, to be more Canadian or American.
My parents are both only children, so.
Right. Sometimes these terms, auntie, uncle, etc., are used not just for your father and mother's sister and brother, but they're used in general for everybody in the older generation. So all the men who are of your parents' age are called uncles.
Yes.
Who comes from a language like that? Not everybody. You realize that Swedish is a language like that, right? Or it used to be. You were supposed to call all older men farbror. It's the same. But you would not call all older women faster. This is interesting. It was only on the male side, not on the female side. But instead you used in Swedish, you used an importation from French. So you call them all tant. Which is, like auntie. It's the same word. Yeah, so that, and also in many countries you have a kind of generalization of the term brother and sister. So you might call all young people, if you're a man, you might call all other males of the same age brother. Who comes from a language like that? Nobody. In Africa there are many languages like that. And you might call all the women sister. In Sweden we actually have remnants of this. So if you're a professor, and professors, maybe Swedes, how many are Swedish people in here? Yeah, do you know that male professors call each other brother? They do. Well, they used to anyway. If you write a letter to another professor, you write broder. Okay, so it shows that these differences in age, and gender, and so on are the focus of various forms of respect. Differences in education often give you power. If you have a higher education, then you have more power than if you have a lower education. Differences in family, clan, and caste are very important. In most countries you have some sort of caste system. India is perhaps the most extreme example. We have a caste system, and you can even be without the caste, and then you're the worst, pariah, untouchable, etc., etc. But most countries have something of this type. So in Sweden and in most European countries, we used to have something called nobility. If you were a noble person, then you had all sorts of privileges, and you could become a count or a baron or a duke or whatever, and you would automatically get a lot of power. But again, I don't know any cultures where you don't have something like this, importance of families, clans, and castes, giving you automatically some power. Differences in ethnic group, sometimes race, that's also very important in many countries. And normally you'll find that some groups, some ethnic groups are given more power than other ethnic groups. So in Sweden, if we take the case again, the Lapps or the Samis definitely had less power than the people who are Swedes. If you go to China, you have all your minority groups. I think they have less power than the Han Chinese. So, and you can go into country after country, and you will see that this kind of pattern repeats itself. Differences in wealth. Being rich gives you power. So rich people normally have more power. Sometimes differences in wealth goes with differences in family. So there are certain families that habitually seem to be rich, and so they normally get more power. So in Europe we have a family called in English you call them the Rothschilds. Have you heard about this family? They've also managed to get them, so they're actually a Jewish family, and they managed still to become a noble family. So you call them Baron Rothschild. And I think they're originally German, so they should be called Rothschild or something. Rothschild, maybe. Yeah. Okay, so you can see sometimes differences in wealth lead to family dominance, and sometimes also to things like nobility. Okay, and the one that's perhaps the most obvious one is differences in organizational and political position. So if you're the CEO of a company, of course, you have more power than those who are under you. If you're the prime minister, you have more power than the other ministers in your council. And if you're a minister, you have more power than the rest of the people in your department, etc. So, these are all things that give you power in different ways. And what I have marked with red are things which I think go across the planet without much discussion. They are very similar from culture to culture. The one in blue is a case which is perhaps not as strong as the ones in red. And the ones in black are things where I think things can vary a lot more. So age differences don't play the same role everywhere. Differences between genders are not exactly the same in terms of power everywhere. Differences due to family, clan, and caste also varies a lot between different cultures. And differences in ethnic group varies as well. So the things in black is where we'll find the biggest cultural variation. And the things in red is where we'll find the least. But it's not just long-term relations that might give you power. Also short-term relations can give you power. So being the chairman of a meeting gives you often more power than not being the chairperson. You can decide on the agenda, you can decide on what is going to be done in the meeting, etc., etc. And you can decide often on who gets to speak and who does not get to speak. You can decide on many things. A doctor normally has more power than a patient. Patient is coming there to get help and has to more or less trust the doctor and do what the doctor says. Teacher normally has more power than the student. And a judge usually has more power than an accused person. So all of these roles that you have in different activities, like in a teaching, in a lecture, in a patient-doctor interview situation, formal meeting, court proceedings, there are certain people who, by their role in the meeting, have more power. Okay, often these differences that exist within a particular social activity can be added to organizational differences. So if you're the boss of a company, that's a more general power-giving position. But you could, in addition to being the boss of the company, also be the chairman of the meeting. Then you would have two sources of power. Okay, you would be the boss and you would be chairman. Imagine the other situation. You are the boss of the company. You go to a meeting where somebody else, somebody who is under you in the company, is the chairperson. Then you get an interesting kind of conflict of power, right? So from one point of view, you're the boss, so people should listen to you. But you're not the chairperson of this meeting. So you don't have the formal right to decide what goes on. That kind of conflict in power-giving sources can sometimes arise. Yes?
I just have a point that these differences, and I think they also vary in culture, like the difference between a judge and accused, for example, in Sweden is different than the relationship between a judge and accused in Egypt, for example.
Yes.
It's a very large difference.
Yes, I agree. That's a good point. These differences, even though there's a power difference, I think, in all cultures here, but the power difference can be very much larger in some cultures than in others. So if we take the example that you took up, that is the difference between judge and accused. In some countries, the judge is not just a judge. I mean, in the American English system, you have a kind of what is called an adversarial system. So you have one lawyer for the accused and the prosecuting side. And these two are, in a sense, arguing in front of the judge, who then passes judgment. Okay, but that's not a universal pattern. So in some countries, the judge takes on the position of the prosecutor. So actually it's the judge who starts to question the person who is accused. And the judge is not neutral the way the judge might be in the English-American system. The judge has one side already from the start. I think that's the case in the Arabic Sharia, right?
Even more, not the Sharia, I'm talking about the system, I think, in Middle Eastern countries. But
Yeah, but it's not just the Middle Eastern. It's actually in the Roman Empire you had that system.
Well,
So
I'm not talking about their like law power, I'm talking about more in reference to the corrupt system.
Yeah, well, that's another difficulty. But already in the formal rules, you get more power with the judge who is conducting all the examination and then passing judgment. Actually, the Swedish system has a little more of that. Swedish system is not as, the judge also in the Swedish system question the accused party. There are interesting cultural differences in the way court procedures are done. They are not the same in all countries. They do give different amounts of power to judge, to the prosecutor, to the defense lawyers, etc. I mean, some places you don't even have defense lawyers. In the old Greek system, you had to defend yourself. And that's why rhetoric became so popular. You have to learn how to do it. Okay, other differences could come in at the same time. So the ethnic group that you belong to, your age, your gender. So it might be, if you were a young woman who is the chairperson of the meeting, you might have a more difficult time than if you're a senior male person in many cultures. So, so different sources of power can be added to each other. Ooh. Okay, so let's look at such a case where we have addition of different sources of power. So A belongs to a macro group which is more powerful than B's. A has one or more long-term properties which gives power in relation to B. And A has an activity role which gives power in relation to B. So let's say that A is American, A is male, and is the chairman of the meeting. So everything is in harmony. It gives that person more and more power. Being from a dominant national group, having an activity role, and having a long-term property. Okay, so that's a case where all the power differences are added to each other. Let's see now if we can get. So this is the case what we already discussed. Yeah, this is reinforcement. They're added to each other. A belongs to dominant culture, is boss and chairman of the meeting. But we can also have a case where the different sources do not reinforce each other, where we have conflict between the sources. So A's culture is dominant, but A and B's culture evaluate some of the factors that give power a little differently. Then the situation becomes a little less clear. A belongs to a non-dominant culture. A is educated and A is doctor. So take the case of a foreign doctor in Sweden. Okay? The patient, let's say, is Swedish, is also educated, we might say, but is not the doctor. What happens now? Who has most power? Is it the foreign doctor or is it the patient who knows the language and the culture better? Somebody's speaking, but I don't know who. Yes, you speak louder.
It's the patient.
You think the patient has more power? Well, it's debatable. What do you think?
I would say in Sweden, patients have more power, but in other countries it will be the opposite.
Even in this situation where the patient knows the language and so on, and the doctor doesn't.
Yes.
The doctor makes mistakes in what they're saying, etc., etc.
Yes, exactly. If it would happen in Russia, for example, in Russia, doctor would be right. Because he's a doctor. But here in Sweden, it's opposed.
You think it's more unclear in Sweden than in Russia? You think the power of the profession is stronger than the power of the language in Russia?
Yes.
Okay. That could be different between different cultures, I agree. Yeah?
I think also depends what foreign country that doctor is from.
Yes, it does. I agree, so there's the macro-social aspect that we just started by discussing, plays a role here too, absolutely. Yeah?
Personality might matter, maybe.
Yeah, so personality is always a joker that you can bring in. Some people just have a stronger personality. Yeah, I agree. That's always something to be reckoned with. So it's not just cultural factors. There are things like maybe the genes have given you a stronger personality. Could be.
Environment.
Yeah, the environment, but also biology. We should not forget there is a biological factor here. Absolutely. Yeah? Okay. So what sources of power are important for what aspects of power and control in what activities? These are open questions. You might see that sometimes the linguistic factor is more important than in other situations. For example, if you're in an academic seminar, the linguistic factor is fairly important because you need to be able to formulate what you have to say. But if you are, I don't know, selling a car, is the linguistic factor less important, or is it the same? Less, I would think. Money speaks. I don't know. Maybe you can make, exert power even if you cannot, if you just have the right financial arguments. Yeah? Okay, if it turns out that actually people have different evaluations, so one culture thinks it's very important to be respectful to older people, and the other culture thinks that no, it's not important at all, older people don't know what they're talking about. So then you might, get a kind of struggle because they don't see the situation in the same way. And they start to compete with each other because they have differing opinions about what gives you power and what doesn't. And then you could have misunderstandings between the parties because they just don't see the situation the same way. They don't understand why what this person says should be so important. Just because he is older, why should we listen to him or her? Okay, let's now look a little at how power is manifested in behavior. So, in general, we could say that if you have more power, you have freer movements. You can do anything you like, basically. Power gives you the right to do what you like. So, a more powerful person can either have bigger movements or decide to have smaller movements. It's actually up to the power person, and they don't have to adjust equally to the social situation. They can sometimes just go outside of the social situation to a greater degree than somebody who has less power. In general, if you have less power, you are more constrained. You do not have the same freedom to have big movements or to be quiet if you want to be quiet, etc. You just have to go along with what's expected to a greater extent. So, for example, if you're choosing language, two people meet, the powerful person can probably decide on which language to use. And also in what way to use the language. If you have less power, you have to follow what the more powerful person says. You also normally perhaps have to use more polite forms. In many situations there is what is sometimes called a power semantic. Power semantic means that the more powerful person uses informal titles to the person who has less power. And the person who has less power uses a formal title to the person who has more power. So if you come from a language where you have, for example, an informal pronoun, Swedish, we have du, and we also have a more formal pronoun ni. If you come from German, you have du und sie, etc., etc. Most of you come from languages where you have several pronouns to choose from. So you can see this situation where the more powerful person will use the informal form, and the less powerful will use the formal back. That, if you get that situation, that's a power semantic situation, and it's asymmetrical. So this is the basic pattern. More power, also freer choice of how to communicate. Less power, more constrained choice of how to communicate. But both of these positions can be constrained by institutionalized roles. So even if you're the king, in certain activities you cannot do exactly what you like. If you have to open the parliament, there is a particular procedure that you have to follow to do it. You cannot do it in any old way. So even people who are in power are constrained by the social roles that they have to occupy. Both sides have that kind of constraints, but the constraints are somewhat less, you might say, for the more powerful. Okay, so let's look at some of the more particular aspects of this. If we look at turn taking, so there's who gets the turn, who gets the right to speak. If you have more power, you have easier access to turns. You can more easily interrupt other people. You can speak for a longer time without being interrupted. And you have the freedom, maybe, if somebody asks you a question, you can perhaps ignore that person. You don't answer the question. So, you can choose yourself if you want to answer or not. If you have less power, you normally have shorter turns. You cannot speak as long. And you cannot really interrupt the other person who has more power. And you cannot really ignore what the other person is saying to you. You have to reply, you have to respond. So your freedom, as you can see, is constrained in many different ways. Yeah?
But what if you are in a lower status position but still claim to be respected on equal?
Well, you might try to rebel against this. So then you will try to behave like the power person. You won't be very popular. They might try to punish you. They will say that you're uneducated, that you're impolite, that you're disrespectful. So they'll use all of these words, to punish you. But that you cannot really use those words to the person who has more power. It doesn't work really, because they do these things, right? In most societies. Also in Sweden. Yeah?
But if you are in a rightful position to do so, if you've been treated, for instance, in an unjust way by the person who has more power, and you know that you would probably have support in the way you behave when trying to get more respect, or...
You can try and see what happens. You might, one thing is you think that it should be right for you to do it, but that doesn't mean that everyone else agrees with it, right? With what you're doing. And the person who has more power is still going to try to use tricks that are disrespectful, that you're not respecting them, etc., etc. Because that's what's, commonly done in that situation. Okay, feedback. That's how we say yes, no, but we show other people that we're listening to them, how we react to what they're saying, etc. If you have more power, you have just a freer choice of feedback. You can choose to give feedback or not give feedback. If you have less power, you really have to give feedback. You have to be there. You have to be aware of what the other person is saying to you. Okay, the sequences, we have different sequences, greeting, question, answer, etc. If you have more power, then you can initiate such sequences. You can start to tell a particular type of joke, or you can start to discuss a particular type of topic, etc., etc. You can initiate sequences of this type. You can greet another person or not greet them. If you have less power, again, you just have less possibilities of initiating such sequences. You have to accept what the more powerful person is doing. And you have to think of all these properties of communication in relation to the sources of power we've talked about before. How age gives you power, how gender gives you power, how organizational position gives you power. All of these things could lead to this kind of behavior.
Question?
Yeah?
The rhetoric skill of the communicator,
Right?
isn't that a factor in how to get more power?
Yes, you can try to go, you can sort of supervene, you can override the power given by your sources of power by your communication skills. I agree, this is sort of what you were saying too in a sense, right? Yeah. You try to sort of use your communication to cancel the influence of the underlying power source. To some extent that can work.
Do you mean that maybe, my question is, can you get more power?
Yeah, certainly. But you should be aware that if you're trying to get power over your boss, the other person is still your boss, right? So you might temporarily succeed, but they still have that organizational position, etc., which gives them the right to decide over you, even though you in a particular situation were stronger in your organization. So you're in a kind of disadvantaged position, and the other person is in an advantaged position. It's easier for the person who has the organizational power to win over you than it is for you to win over them. So you have to be a lot better than them in your communicational skills. Yeah. Yeah?
I was just thinking about one example. It's like a connection of organizational power and a relation. Kind of relationship. So I had one experience where I was working in a company and had an internship, like a small kid who just wanted to have an insight in our company. The problem was that he was the son of my boss.
Oh, now we get to the guy. Yeah.
So my boss has obviously more power than me.
Yes.
And I should normally have more power because I was kind of the supervisor of the intern guy.
Right.
Should have more power over him, but it was like, okay, I can't use my power because then it was like, if he feels like unsatisfied or is like annoyed because of me, he would just go to his father, who has more power about me, would kind of make me, I don't know. So there's like a shift or a kind of connection. Like he has kind of power as well, even when he has not really power in this.
But he did. I mean, since he was the son of the owner or the boss of the company, that power is inherited by the son.
Yeah.
So it's a very good example of how there are conflicting sources of power. You in a sense, organizational, was supposed to be over that person, but he was linked to a more fundamental power, which was over you. So then there was a conflicting case, and I guess, then you have to, what this is often called is sub-optimizing. Sub-optimizing, you know that term?
I think I know what you mean.
Yeah, you don't understand what it means. So there are these conflicting sources that you somehow have to balance and come up with something. That's often the case in real life, that these different sources conflict to some extent. We talked about it this morning also in relation to ethical norms. They often come in conflict and you have to sub-optimize. Yeah? If you have more power, you also have greater freedom when it comes to different kinds of speech acts. So you can pass judgment on other people. You can say that, you did that very, very well done. Good, very well. And you could, you might say that's not so good. Maybe you should go and practice what you're doing a little more. Things like that. You can pass judgment, you can give compliments, you can criticize people. That's a lot harder to do for those who are subordinate towards their boss. I mean, some people actually do that. They come and say to the boss, what they usually do is they give the boss compliments. And that's called ingratiation. You try to be nice to the boss to get some advantage from being nice to the boss. But it's harder to come to the boss and say, you didn't do that so well. Maybe you should go home and try to, practice a bit. What you're doing. See, there's an imbalance. It's much easier for the boss to say that to the employee than it is for the employee to say it to the boss. Okay, so this kind of speech acts are much more freely given when you have power than when you don't have power. When it comes to the topic content of what you're discussing, if you have more power, you can choose what you want to discuss. The boss can say, let's discuss, what we're going to do during our visit to China. Or what we're going to do when we go on Christmas holiday, or whatever. And it's harder for a subordinate person to come up, and especially if you want to change the topic that the boss is talking about, not so easy. Easier for the boss to change the topic that you're talking about. So, boss again has freer choice of topic, perspective, agenda. This is important, for example, in meetings. They talk about the power over the agenda. What is going to be discussed in the meeting? Who decides? Well, usually the chairman or sometimes the boss behind the chairman, the chairperson, and you set the agenda. We will discuss this and we'll discuss it in this order, etc., etc. That's, to be able to decide that often gives you a lot of power. Forms of address. Well, we talked about that already, the power semantic. And if you have more power, you can use less polite forms. If you have less power, you have to use more polite, more respectful forms. We have a general tendency in the Western world anyway to for more egalitarian ways of talking. And perhaps you are now in the country on this planet where this development has gone the furthest. So in Sweden we used to have a very complicated system of titles 50 years ago. Everybody had to use it, and it was very, very difficult to not use it. But today we almost don't use titles. Not even, the innocent little difference between a formal and an informal pronoun. We just use the informal pronoun. Although there are a lot of young people in Sweden, I think I told you about this once before, did I? They have misunderstood the situation. So immigrants and young people in Sweden think that we have a system of two pronouns, like in German, du und sie, did und ich. So they start to use ni to older people. But we who are older people, who were in the situation where we changed the system in Sweden from a very formal system, this happened in the 1960s and 70s, and we stopped using titles, we stopped using ni, we started just saying du in Sweden. We don't accept going back to using ni, which is, immigrants in Sweden think that you're being disrespectful to older people, so you should use a more polite form, ni. And so we find many immigrants in Sweden calling, for example, me, they say ni to me, and then I say du to them. So this is the power semantic, but the reason in this case isn't really the classical power semantic, but it's more that I don't want to undo a reform that I was part of making. Yeah.
I recall the case when I was at the conference, and there was a Swedish moderator of the conference, and there was an Australian guy giving a lecture.
Yeah.
And he had the title Dr. James or whatever.
Yeah.
And she was always introducing him just James, and he was always correcting her that Dr. James. And well, he didn't, he was not insulted by it. He knew that it's different here, but he asked her a couple of times to call him Dr. James. And for him, that was.
Yeah, but I mean, Sweden is an exception in the world.
Yeah.
Sweden is really exception. I mean, everywhere else. I just came from Malaysia and Cambodia last week, right? What do you think they call me? They call me Jens. Never.
Never in the world.
No. They call me, of course, Professor Allwood, or actually in Malaysia they say Professor Jens. Because they don't normally have a first and a last name. So they just go, they are more used to a person having only one name, so they use that name. Okay, so that forms of address are an important part of the power game. How you address people, to be respectful, to be more polite. Now we're there again. Stop. Okay, to get to a summary. If you're more powerful, you have a choice of topics, perspectives, issues, judgments, forms of address, pronouns, and greetings. And if you're less powerful, then there's a big constraint on your choice of topics, issues, what kind of judgments you can pass, forms of address, pronouns, greetings. So I think this is and I think this is a universal pattern also, that we can look at all the languages of the world and you'll find this kind of, in principle, this difference. So those that have more power have more freedom to do what they like. Those who have less, they have to go along with what the more powerful people say. So, that should get us to... Okay, that was the last slide. So, this, I was trying to give you a picture of what power differences exist in intercultural communication, and you've noticed that there is quite the cultural variation in sources of power, and that you cannot always expect people to have the same opinion about what is powerful and what is not powerful, and how you should treat those people that have more power than yourself. Thank you.